Hey guys, today's video is going to close out the chapter, and we are going to have a quiz on Monday, and I'll give you some tips to review for that quiz once we get done with the content today. I'm going to keep this video shorter than our previous videos have been because most of you are already live streaming a 45-minute College Board AP exam prep every day, and I don't want to overburden you guys. But if you want extra clarification or anything like that, please email me. I'd be happy to spend some extra time working through this with you. All right, so just to pick up where we left off, as the war dragged on, as the Vietnam War dragged on, public support for the war declined. So the more the war went on, the more public support dropped. And the Democratic Party is really struggling right now because their candidate, who is the incumbent, he's the president, Lyndon Johnson, is really, really unpopular. With an approval rating of around 35%, it's very unlikely that he's going to be reelected. So there's a subversive campaign within the Democratic Party to find someone to run in the primaries to unseat LBJ as the nominee. So you would have a sitting president who typically is the nominee. The idea is to unseat him so he wouldn't be the nominee, so he wouldn't be running for president, and someone else who's new would run for president in his place. And it's politics. And the goal of politics is to win for your party, but it's also not good manners, politically speaking. So here we go with this. The Democratic Party, they're going to try to find someone who they think can beat LBJ in the primaries. So they've picked Eugene McCarthy. Well, actually, initially they picked Robert Kennedy. All right, so Robert Kennedy, he's in the Kennedy family, and he might be able to beat LBJ, but initially Robert Kennedy's like, this doesn't feel very good. I'm not going to do this. So they pick Eugene McCarthy, and Eugene McCarthy's like, yeah, I'll do this. I'll run against LBJ in the primaries. Well, he starts getting popular support, and then Robert Kennedy's like, well, okay, if Eugene McCarthy's getting popular support, maybe I can actually beat LBJ. So he throws his hat in the ring too. So he had initially said no, then he says yes. So then you have two possible people in the primary who could unseat LBJ. One of them could, right? But then there's a conflict for support to see which of these candidates in the primary will we support to unseat LBJ. And as you know, when there's a split within the party, oftentimes it's very difficult to elect anybody from that party. So as his popularity wanes, Lyndon Johnson decides he's just not going to run for president. Rather than losing the primaries, which would be extremely embarrassing. I mean, it's unheard of, right, for a sitting president to not get the primary win and continue to run for president, because there's always that incumbent advantage. So Lyndon Johnson decides that since the U.S. can't stand him because of Vietnam and the way they view his handling of Vietnam, he's just not going to run for president again in the election of 1968. So now things get really, really complex because Hubert Humphrey decides he's going to join. So we have the VP, he's going to join and try to win as well. So now we have three prominent Democrats who are all running to get the nomination for president, and the sitting president decides not to run for re-election. There's just pandemonium in the Democratic Party at this point in time. So also things of note during this time, as the primary elections are going and as the scale up for that is coming, Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on April 4th. All right, this just sends the nation into more turmoil. All right, so there's more racial tension. And also, it's just a really sad time for the nation because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was such a prominent figure and such an important figure in that time. And then 2 months later, almost to the day, not quite to the day, it's like 2 months and 2 days later, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. So one of those three main candidates that were trying to get the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party is assassinated. So this means that Hubert Humphrey then is going to be the clear pick for the Democratic Party. But not all the Democrats like this. And again, there's just so much division in the Democratic Party that at the Democratic National Convention, there are actually anti-Humphrey riots that break out. So Hubert Humphrey, he ends up winning the nomination to run for president, but so many people in his party dislike him so much, there's actually rioting in the streets over the fact that he's the nominee. So as the election comes up, now we have even more complexity. I'm just going to keep it simple and say that Nixon wins the election, and he wins the election, the electoral vote, very, very easily. He gets 301 electoral votes. But he only won by about 1% of the popular vote. So he doesn't really win as handily as it looks as far as the electoral votes are concerned. And when Nixon wins, he doesn't inherit the most stable nation in the world. That's putting it lightly, right? Because America is reeling from the Vietnam War, and there's a division in America about whether to continue the war effort or not, because we don't want to lose, right? Above all, we don't want to lose, but we also don't want to continue the war. And so there's a growing division in America over the war. Also, there's a lot of anti-war anger, like the anti-war protests are ramping up, and the intensity of these protests and demonstrations is going to ramp up. So Nixon inherits an unstable America, and there's just a politically divided nation overall, not just war, anti-war, but just the nation's not all that united at this point in time. And Nixon's the one that inherits this. Plus, don't forget the Cold War is still going on. So this is all that Nixon has on his plate as he's the newly elected president, and we're going to see in the coming chapters how he handles this. All right, so that's it for today. Now, what I want you to be focusing on, because keep in mind, all of this falls under the Cold War. I want you to be focusing on the Cold War and how the Cold War is impacted by and how it impacts foreign relations during the 50s and 60s. Now, I know that this chapter is mostly on the 60s, but this is the point in time in the year where we're going to be responsible for previous chapters' material in current chapters' assessments, because we're getting ready to hit the AP exam where you're responsible for all of it. All right, so I want you to start putting these pieces together. So you should be thinking Korean War. I mean, I know we already studied that, so it should be really fresh in your mind. Korean War would be a great example of foreign policy, right? Containment would be another great example of foreign policy. Domino theory, and then Vietnam War, as far as containment theory is concerned, would be another example of how these things, as far as foreign policy, were impacted by the overall Cold War. If you have any other questions, shoot me an email, but I would base your study around most of those things. Always good to have a broad content knowledge, but, I would spend the majority of the study time on those things, and then, try to find a few outside time frame issues to highlight to bring into your responses. All right. Thanks for all the good work this week, everybody. If you have any questions, email me. And if not, I hope you all have a great weekend.